The evening had just begun, but the grand dining hall was already filled with a quiet kind of energy. Warm lights glowed from crystal chandeliers above, reflecting softly on polished marble floors. The air carried the mixed scent of fresh food, coffee, and expensive perfume. Guests dressed in elegant clothes sat at neatly arranged tables, talking in low voices while waiters moved smoothly between them. At the far corner of the room stood a beautiful black piano. It had been there for years, and almost everyone who visited the hotel expected to hear music from it during dinner. Music had a way of making the place feel calm and refined. It was part of the hotel's charm. That evening, the pianist sat proudly at the instrument, his back straight and his hands moving confidently across the keys. He was known for his skill. Many guests recognized him and sometimes even came to the hotel just to hear him play. Some said his music could turn an ordinary dinner into something memorable. He knew people admired him. The applause at the end of each performance had made that very clear over the years. Because of that, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that sometimes looked a little like pride. The music flowing from the piano was light and cheerful that night. It drifted across the room like a gentle breeze, filling the space between conversations. A few guests tapped their fingers against their glasses in rhythm with the melody. Others simply listened while enjoying their meals. Near the center of the room, moving quickly but carefully between tables, was a young servant. She wore the same simple uniform as the rest of the staff. Her job was to clear empty plates, refill glasses, and make sure every guest had what they needed. Most people barely noticed her. She had learned how to move quietly so she wouldn't disturb anyone. Years of working in busy places had taught her how to stay invisible while still doing everything perfectly. But there was one thing about her that no one in the room knew. Every time the piano music began, something inside her changed. While carrying plates or wiping tables, she would sometimes slow down for just a moment. Not enough for anyone to complain, just long enough to listen. Her eyes would drift toward the piano. It was never for long, just a few seconds. Then she would quickly return to her work. To most people, it looked like nothing. Maybe she was simply curious about the music like anyone else. But the truth was much deeper than that. The music reminded her of something from long ago. Years earlier, before life had become complicated, before long work hours and responsibilities filled her days, she had once known the sound of a piano very well. In a small house where she grew up, there had been an old piano that barely stayed in tune. Its wood was worn and the keys were slightly yellow with age. But to her, it had been the most beautiful instrument in the world. She used to sit in front of it whenever she had the chance. Sometimes she played slowly, trying to copy melodies she heard on the radio. Other times she simply pressed the keys and listened to the sound fill the small room. Back then, playing the piano felt like entering another world. But life had changed since those days. Responsibilities had arrived early. Work became necessary. Dreams had quietly stepped aside to make space for reality. The piano slowly disappeared from her life. Now she spent her evenings carrying trays instead of playing music. Still, whenever she heard piano notes drifting through a room, memories returned. That evening was no different. As she passed by one table, balancing two plates carefully in her hands, the melody from the piano shifted into something softer. The notes seemed to float through the air, slow and thoughtful. She paused for half a second. Her eyes moved toward the corner of the room where the pianist sat. His fingers moved quickly and effortlessly. He looked relaxed, almost playful, as if the music required no effort at all. A small part of her admired that. Another part quietly wondered what it would feel like to sit at the piano again. But she quickly pushed that thought away. There was work to do. At a nearby table, two guests were discussing the performance. "He plays beautifully," one of them said while sipping a drink. "Yes," the other replied. "It almost feels effortless for him." The servant placed fresh glasses on their table and smiled politely before moving on. Across the room, the pianist continued playing. His music filled every corner of the hall. From where he sat, he could see most of the dining room. Years of performing had trained him to notice small reactions from the audience. a nod of appreciation, a smile, someone quietly humming along. Those small signs told him whether the music was being enjoyed. And that was when he noticed something unusual. The servant. Not once, but several times throughout the evening, he saw her glance toward the piano. At first he didn't think much of it. But after the third or fourth time it caught his attention. She wasn't looking at the guests or the fancy room around her. She was looking directly at the piano. Not with curiosity. With focus. It was the kind of look someone had when they were studying something they understood. The pianist raised one eyebrow slightly as he continued playing. Interesting, he thought. He finished the piece and the room responded with light applause. He gave a polite nod and prepared to begin another song. As his fingers touched the keys again, he noticed the servant passing by once more with a tray of empty glasses. And again, for just a moment, she glanced at the piano. This time he smiled slightly to himself. To him, it looked almost amusing. A servant fascinated by the piano. Perhaps she imagined what it might feel like to play such an instrument. He had seen that kind of curiosity before, but he never expected anything more from it. After all, playing the piano well required years of training, discipline, and dedication. It was not something someone simply picked up by chance. The music continued, and the evening moved forward as usual. Guests laughed. Plates clinked softly. Conversations flowed. But somewhere between the music and the quiet glances toward the piano, something small had begun to take shape. No one in the room realized it yet. Not the guests. Not the waiters. Not even the pianist himself. But before the night ended, something unexpected was going to happen. Something that would turn a simple moment of amusement into a memory no one in that dining hall would ever forget. The music from the piano continued to flow through the dining hall, calm and smooth like a quiet stream. Guests were enjoying their meals, some talking softly while others simply listened. The evening had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Plates were being served, glasses were being filled, and the pianist moved from one melody to the next with practiced ease. From where he sat, the pianist could see nearly everything happening in the room. Years of performing had made him very aware of his surroundings. Even while playing, he noticed small details most people would ignore. And once again, his attention drifted toward the young servant moving between the tables. She worked quickly, carrying trays, clearing plates, and politely responding to guests. Nothing about her actions seemed unusual. She was doing exactly what any staff member would do during a busy dinner service. Yet every now and then, her eyes briefly moved toward the piano. It happened so quickly that most people would never notice it. But the pianist had already seen it several times that evening. At first he thought it was simply curiosity. Many people looked at the piano while music played. But the way she looked at it felt different somehow. She didn't stare at the pianist himself. Her attention always went to the keys. He played a faster piece, letting his fingers move quickly across the keyboard. The notes danced lightly through the air, drawing smiles from several tables nearby. As the melody filled the room, he glanced up again. The servant had just finished clearing a table near the center of the hall. She lifted a tray filled with empty glasses and turned to walk toward the service area. And for a brief second, she paused. Her eyes moved toward the piano. The pianist noticed it immediately. This time he couldn't help smiling to himself. To him, the moment looked slightly amusing. It reminded him of people who admired something they believed was far beyond their reach. He had spent most of his life around music. Years of lessons, practice, and performances had shaped him into the musician he was today. Playing the piano felt as natural to him as breathing. So when he saw someone watching the instrument with quiet fascination, he sometimes found it entertaining. He finished the piece and the room responded with polite applause. A few guests even clapped enthusiastically. He stood briefly and gave a small bow before sitting down again. The manager of the dining hall walked past and leaned slightly toward him. "Wonderful as always," the manager said quietly. The pianist nodded with a confident smile. As he prepared for the next piece, his eyes moved around the room again. The servant had returned to work, now carrying a tray with fresh drinks. She moved carefully between chairs, making sure not to bump into anyone. One of the guests at a nearby table spoke loudly enough for others to hear. "This music makes the whole evening feel special," the guest said happily. Another guest nodded. "Yes, it's one of the reasons we like coming here." The pianist heard the compliment and felt pleased. He began playing another melody, this one slower and more dramatic. The notes stretched gently across the dining hall. As he played, his thoughts returned to the servant. He noticed her again near the back of the room, placing new plates on a table. And again there it was, that quick glance toward the piano. By now the pianist was certain it wasn't random. He leaned slightly closer to the keys while continuing the melody, thinking quietly to himself. Perhaps she simply loved music. Or perhaps she had never seen someone play the piano up close before. The idea amused him. A playful thought began forming in his mind. After finishing the piece, he paused for a moment before starting the next one. The room settled into quiet conversation again. Several guests raised their glasses while talking about the music. The servant passed by another table and carefully wiped a small spill before moving on. The pianist watched her again. She was focused on her work, moving quickly so the guests would not have to wait for anything. But even while working, she seemed aware of the piano in the corner of the room. The pianist leaned back slightly on the bench and stretched his fingers. He had performed hundreds of evenings just like this one. Most nights followed the same pattern. Music, applause, polite smiles. Everything predictable. But sometimes he liked adding small moments of humor to entertain the guests. And suddenly, a playful idea appeared in his mind. He looked toward a group of guests sitting at a nearby table. They were already watching him with interest. With a relaxed smile, he began speaking to them casually. "Tell me something," he said in a light tone. "Do you ever wonder what would happen if someone else tried playing this piano?" The guests chuckled softly. One of them replied jokingly, "It probably wouldn't sound as good." The pianist laughed. "Well," he said, glancing across the room, "maybe we should test that theory." The guests leaned forward slightly, curious about what he meant. The pianist slowly turned his head toward the servant who had just finished setting down a tray of glasses. She didn't realize she was being watched. But several guests followed the direction of his gaze. Soon a few people noticed who he was looking at. The servant suddenly became aware of the attention. She looked up, confused. The pianist smiled in a friendly but playful way. "Excuse me," he called gently. She stopped walking and looked toward him. "Yes?" she replied politely. A few guests turned their chairs slightly so they could see what was happening. The pianist gestured toward the piano with one hand. "You seem interested in the music tonight," he said casually. "Would you like to try playing a few notes?" For a moment, the servant simply stared at him. She wasn't sure if she had heard correctly. The nearby tables became quiet. A couple of guests laughed softly, assuming it was just a harmless joke meant to entertain the room. The servant quickly shook her head. "Oh no," she said politely. "I'm working." Her voice was calm, but there was a hint of nervousness in it. The pianist chuckled lightly. "It's only for a moment," he said. "Just a few notes." The guests nearby began smiling and whispering to each other. Someone said jokingly, "Go ahead, try it." Another guest laughed. "Yes, let's hear it." The servant felt dozens of eyes turning toward her. She held the empty tray tightly in her hands. Her first instinct was to refuse again and quietly return to work. But the room was already watching. The pianist leaned back slightly on the bench, clearly enjoying the moment. To him, it was simply a bit of light entertainment. Nothing serious. Just a quick joke before the music continued. But the servant stood there frozen for a moment, unsure what to do. She looked around the room. Many guests were smiling with curiosity. The manager stood near the entrance, also watching with interest. There was a brief silence in the dining hall. The servant slowly placed the tray on a nearby table. Then she looked toward the piano again. The instrument stood quietly under the warm lights. For a moment, memories from long ago rushed back into her mind. The sound of an old piano in a small house. Fingers touching worn keys. Music filling a quiet room. She took a slow breath. The guests were still watching. The pianist smiled patiently, certain that nothing serious would come from the moment. Finally, after a long pause, the servant began walking toward the piano. Her steps were slow and careful. The room grew quieter with each step she took. Some guests leaned forward, curious to see what would happen next. Others smiled, expecting a few awkward notes before laughter filled the room again. The pianist moved slightly aside on the bench to make space for her. He still looked relaxed and amused. To him, the situation was simple. A small joke. A short moment of entertainment. But as the servant reached the piano and quietly sat down on the bench, something in the room began to change. The laughter faded. The air grew strangely still. And no one yet realized that the next few moments were about to surprise every person in that dining hall. The moment the servant sat down on the piano bench, the entire room felt different. Just a few seconds earlier, there had been quiet laughter and light conversation. Now a strange silence had settled over the dining hall. Dozens of eyes were fixed on the piano. The servant sat very still for a moment. The large black instrument in front of her seemed even bigger now that she was so close to it. The polished surface reflected the warm lights from the chandeliers above. She placed both hands gently on her lap. For a few seconds, she didn't move. The pianist stood beside the bench, leaning slightly against the side of the piano. His expression was relaxed, almost playful. To him, the moment still felt like harmless entertainment for the guests. Some people in the audience smiled quietly, waiting to see what would happen next. A man sitting near the front table whispered to the person beside him, "She probably doesn't know where to start." Another guest chuckled softly. The servant heard some of the whispers, but she kept her eyes on the piano keys. The keys looked exactly as she remembered. Black and white, lined up in a long row, waiting to be touched. For a brief moment, the noise of the dining hall faded in her mind. The clinking glasses, the soft conversations, even the quiet laughter disappeared from her thoughts. All she could see were the keys. And suddenly memories began returning. She remembered sitting in front of the old piano from her childhood. It had been placed against a wall in a small room where sunlight would shine through a narrow window during the afternoon. The piano had not been perfect. Some of the notes were slightly out of tune. A few keys made soft clicking sounds when pressed. But none of that had mattered to her back then. To her, the instrument had felt magical. She used to sit for hours, slowly learning how different notes sounded together. At first, she only played simple melodies. Over time, she began trying more complicated pieces she heard on the radio or from passing musicians in town. No one had formally taught her. She had simply listened, practiced, and tried again. The memory made her chest tighten slightly. Life had taken her far away from that small room and the old piano. Years of work had filled her days. Long hours had left little time for anything else. Eventually, the music had slowly disappeared from her routine. But the feeling of touching the keys had never truly left her. Now, sitting in front of the grand piano in the middle of a beautiful dining hall, that feeling had returned all at once. The servant slowly lifted her hands from her lap. A few guests leaned forward in their chairs. Someone quietly said, "Here we go." The pianist crossed his arms loosely and watched with mild curiosity. The servant placed her fingers gently above the keys. For a moment they hovered in the air. Her heart was beating faster now. She was very aware that the entire room was watching. Part of her wanted to stand up immediately and apologize. It would have been easy to say she had changed her mind. But another part of her felt something stronger. It had been many years since she last touched a piano. And yet, something deep inside her remembered exactly how it felt. She took a slow breath. Then she closed her eyes for just a second. When she opened them again, her fingers slowly lowered onto the keys. The first note sounded softly. It was simple, quiet, almost hesitant. A few guests exchanged amused glances. One man near the back gave a small shrug as if to say, "Just as expected." But the servant didn't stop. Her fingers pressed another key, then another. The sound of the piano began forming a gentle melody. At first it was slow and careful, like someone testing each step while walking across a narrow bridge. The pianist watched calmly, still leaning against the instrument. But after a few more notes, something about the sound caught his attention. The servant's fingers began moving more confidently. The melody started connecting together in a smooth pattern. A woman at a nearby table straightened slightly in her chair. "That sounds nice," she whispered quietly. The servant's hands were no longer hesitant. They moved across the keyboard with growing certainty, as if remembering something long forgotten. The melody became fuller. Each note flowed naturally into the next. The laughter that had filled the room earlier had completely disappeared. Guests who had been whispering just moments before now sat silently, listening. The pianist slowly uncrossed his arms. His expression began to change. This was not what he had expected. The servant leaned slightly closer to the piano as her fingers continued moving. The melody was no longer simple, carried emotion. The music rose gently, then softened again like a quiet wave moving across water. A guest near the front table set down his glass without realizing it, his eyes fixed on the pianist's bench. Another person whispered softly, "Wait, she actually knows how to play." The pianist straightened his posture. He stepped a little closer to the piano, listening carefully now. The servant's hands moved smoothly across the keys, traveling from one end of the keyboard to the other. The melody began building into something richer and more expressive. It was not the playing of someone randomly pressing keys. It was the playing of someone who understood the instrument, someone who felt the music deeply. The servant herself seemed to forget where she was. Her attention was fully inside the music now. Each note carried a quiet story. Years of forgotten practice seemed to return through her fingers. The dining hall had become completely silent. Even the waiters standing near the walls had paused their work. Everyone was watching. Everyone was listening. The pianist felt a strange mix of surprise and curiosity growing inside him. The small joke he had made earlier suddenly didn't feel like a joke anymore. Something unexpected was unfolding right in front of him. And the music had only just begun. The dining hall had never been this quiet before. Moments earlier, the room had been filled with soft conversations, the clinking of glasses, and quiet laughter. Now all of that had disappeared. The only sound that remained was the piano. The servant's fingers moved across the keys with growing confidence. What had started as a simple melody was slowly turning into something deeper and more powerful. People who had been smiling only a minute ago were now sitting completely still. At the table closest to the piano, a guest slowly leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table without realizing it. His eyes stayed fixed on the servant's hands as they moved across the keyboard. Another guest who had been halfway through taking a sip of water slowly lowered the glass back to the table. No one wanted to interrupt the moment. The pianist stood just a few steps away from the bench, watching carefully. At first he had expected the music to stumble or fade away after a few notes. But instead, the servant's playing continued to grow stronger. Her fingers no longer hesitated. They moved quickly and smoothly, gliding from one set of keys to another. The melody rose and fell like a story being told through music. There was emotion in every note. The pianist's relaxed smile had slowly disappeared. Now his face showed something closer to disbelief. He listened closely, trying to understand what he was hearing. This was not the playing of someone who had simply tried the piano once or twice. This was skill. Real skill. The servant leaned slightly closer to the instrument, her posture calm but focused. Her eyes followed the keys while her hands moved naturally across the keyboard. She seemed completely lost in the music. It was as if the room around her no longer existed. Years of quiet memories seemed to be flowing through her fingers. Every note carried feeling, like a voice speaking without words. At a table near the back of the room, a woman whispered softly to her companion. "She's incredible." The companion nodded slowly without taking his eyes off the piano. "I didn't expect that at all." Another guest nearby quietly said, "Neither did I." The sound of the piano filled the hall, rich and expressive. The melody grew more complex, moving from gentle passages to stronger, more dramatic notes. The servant's hands crossed over each other smoothly, her fingers landing exactly where they needed to be. The pianist took another step closer. He was no longer leaning casually. Now he stood upright, watching every movement with intense focus. He recognized the patterns in the music. They were not random. They were structured, thoughtful, and carefully played. He felt a strange sensation rising inside him. Part surprise, part admiration, and a small part embarrassment. Just a few minutes earlier, he had asked her to play as a joke. He had expected awkward notes and nervous laughter from the crowd. But now the entire room was captivated. The music continued building, filling the large hall with sound that felt both powerful and emotional. One of the waiters who had been carrying a tray stopped near the wall, completely forgetting where he had been going. He stood there quietly, listening. Even the manager near the entrance had stopped moving. No one wanted to break the moment. The servant's playing became faster for a brief section, her fingers dancing across the keys with surprising speed. The notes flowed together beautifully, creating a melody that felt alive. A man sitting near the front slowly shook his head in disbelief. "I can't believe this," he murmured. At another table, a guest placed a hand over her chest, as if the music had touched something deep inside her. There was something honest about the way the servant played. It didn't feel like a performance meant to impress people. It felt personal, real. The pianist felt the same thing as he listened. He had heard countless performances over the years, including many from trained musicians. But there was something special about this moment. The servant was not trying to show off. She was simply playing the music the way she felt it. That honesty gave the melody a unique warmth. As the piece continued, the servant's hands moved more freely. The hesitation from the beginning had completely disappeared. Now her playing felt natural, comfortable, almost effortless. A gentle smile appeared on her face without her noticing it. For the first time that evening, she looked peaceful. The music began to slow slightly, moving into a softer section. The notes became delicate, almost whispering through the air. Guests leaned even closer, afraid to miss a single sound. The pianist realized that the entire dining hall had become part of the moment. People who had come only for dinner were now witnessing something unexpected, something unforgettable. The servant played the final part of the melody slowly, allowing each note to ring clearly before moving to the next. The sound echoed gently through the hall. Then, after one final chord, her hands lifted from the keys. For a moment, nothing happened. The room stayed completely silent. It was the kind of silence that appears when people are still processing what they have just experienced. The servant slowly opened her hands and placed them back in her lap. She seemed almost surprised herself, as if she had suddenly remembered where she was. Her eyes moved cautiously toward the guests sitting around the room. Dozens of people were staring at her, not with amusement, not with laughter, but with amazement. A few seconds passed. Then one person at the front table began clapping. The sound broke the silence. Another person joined in. Then another. Within moments, the entire dining hall filled with applause. Guests clapped loudly, some even standing from their chairs. The sound of appreciation echoed through the room, louder than anything heard that evening. The servant looked stunned. She had never expected such a reaction. The pianist stood beside the piano, completely still for a moment. Then he slowly began clapping as well. But unlike the others, his applause carried a different meaning. Carried respect. Because he now understood something he had not realized earlier. The quiet servant he had invited to the piano as a joke was not simply someone curious about music. She was a musician, and somehow, without anyone knowing, she had been carrying that talent quietly within her all along. The applause continued to echo through the dining hall. It was louder than anything heard in the room that evening. Guests who had come simply to enjoy dinner were now clapping with genuine excitement. Some even stood from their chairs, smiling and shaking their heads in disbelief. The servant remained seated at the piano bench for a moment, unsure of what to do. Her hands rested quietly in her lap while she looked around the room. All the eyes that had once watched her with curiosity were now filled with admiration. She had not expected that. A few minutes earlier she had only been trying to avoid attention and finish her work. Now the entire dining hall seemed focused on her. The pianist stood beside the piano, clapping slowly along with the guests. His expression had completely changed from the playful smile he had earlier. Now there was respect in his eyes. He had spent years performing on that piano, and he knew exactly how difficult it was to make music sound that natural and emotional. What the servant had just done was not luck. It was real ability. The applause finally began to fade, though many guests were still smiling and whispering to each other. The servant slowly stood up from the bench. For a brief moment she looked as if she might quietly return to her work, hoping the attention would end. But before she could step away, a voice from one of the tables spoke up. "That was beautiful," a guest said warmly. Another guest added, "Truly wonderful." More voices followed. "Yes, amazing. I wasn't expecting that at all. You play wonderfully." The servant felt her face grow slightly warm from the attention. She wasn't used to being praised like this. For years she had simply done her work quietly without anyone noticing much. The pianist stepped forward slightly and looked at her with a thoughtful expression. "I owe you an apology," he said calmly. His voice was clear enough for the nearby tables to hear. The room became quiet again as people listened. "When I invited you to play," he continued, "I thought it would just be a small joke for the evening." A few guests nodded quietly, remembering the moment. The pianist shook his head slightly. "But what you played was no joke." He gestured gently toward the piano. "That was real music." The servant looked surprised by his honesty. She lowered her eyes for a moment before speaking softly. "I'm sorry if I interrupted the evening," she said. Several guests quickly responded. "No, not at all. Not even close. That was the best part of the night." The pianist smiled slightly. "You didn't interrupt anything," he said. "You improved it." The servant seemed unsure how to respond. Compliments were not something she received often. A guest from one of the nearby tables leaned forward curiously. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked. Another guest nodded in agreement. "Yes, you must have studied somewhere." The servant hesitated for a moment. She looked at the piano again before answering. "I didn't really study," she said quietly. A few people exchanged surprised looks. The pianist raised his eyebrows slightly. "Then how did you learn?" he asked. The servant thought for a moment, as if deciding how much to explain. "When I was younger," she began slowly, "there was an old piano in the house where I lived." Her voice remained calm and simple. "It wasn't very good," she continued. "Some of the keys didn't work properly, and it was often out of tune." A few guests smiled gently as they imagined the scene. "But I loved the sound of it," she said. She rested one hand lightly on the piano bench. "I used to spend a lot of time sitting there, trying to play the songs I heard on the radio." The guests listened closely. "At first it was difficult," she said. "But after a while I began to understand how the notes worked together." She paused for a moment. "I practiced whenever I could." The pianist listened carefully, fascinated by her story. "And then?" he asked. The servant gave a small, thoughtful smile. "Life became busy," she said simply. Several guests understood what she meant without needing further explanation. Responsibilities had a way of changing people's paths. "Eventually I had to work," she continued. "There wasn't much time for music anymore." The room stayed quiet. Someone near the back of the hall whispered softly, "That's a shame." The pianist nodded slowly. "How long has it been since you last played?" he asked. The servant thought carefully before answering. "A few years," she said. A quiet murmur spread among the guests. "A few years?" someone repeated with surprise. The pianist looked genuinely stunned. "You mean to tell me," he said, "that you haven't played in years? And you just sat down and performed like that?" The servant shrugged slightly. "I suppose I never really forgot," she replied. The simplicity of her answer made several guests smile. One woman at a nearby table said softly, "Some things stay in the heart." The pianist nodded in agreement. "That's very true." He looked at the piano again, then back at the servant. "You have something special," he said sincerely. The servant looked slightly embarrassed by the praise. "It was just a song I remembered," she replied quietly. The pianist shook his head gently. "No," he said. "It was much more than that." A guest from the front table spoke again. "You should keep playing," he suggested. "Talent like that shouldn't disappear." Another guest added, "Yes, you clearly have a gift." The servant listened politely but didn't respond immediately. She had spent so long living a different kind of life that imagining a return to music felt almost impossible. Still, the encouragement in the room was real. For the first time in years, the idea of playing again didn't seem so distant. The pianist placed a hand lightly on the edge of the piano. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I've performed here for many years." He glanced around the dining hall. "But tonight might be the most surprising evening I've ever experienced." A few guests laughed softly in agreement. The servant looked around the room again, still slightly overwhelmed by the attention. Only an hour earlier she had been moving quietly between tables, doing her job like any other evening. Now people were speaking to her with admiration. It felt almost unreal. The pianist smiled warmly. "Well," he said gently, "I think everyone here is glad you sat down at that piano tonight." The guests nodded and murmured their agreement. And though the evening was far from over, it had already become a story many of them knew they would remember for a long time. The dining hall slowly began to return to its normal rhythm, but the feeling in the room had clearly changed. Guests started talking again, waiters moved between tables, and the gentle sound of dishes being placed on the tables returned. Yet the energy in the air was different now. Something memorable had happened, and everyone could feel it. Many of the guests continued looking toward the piano from time to time, as if they were still thinking about the music they had just heard. The servant stood quietly beside the bench for a moment, unsure of what she should do next. Her work was waiting for her, and she knew she could not stand there forever while the dining hall continued running. Still, it felt strange to simply walk away after such a moment. The pianist noticed her hesitation and gave a small reassuring smile. "You should probably get back to your work before the manager thinks I've stolen one of the staff," he said in a light and friendly tone. A few guests laughed gently. The servant nodded politely. "Yes," she said softly. "There are still many tables to take care of." She stepped away from the piano and reached for the tray she had placed earlier on a nearby table. For a moment she looked exactly like she had before, just another worker moving quietly through the room. But the way people looked at her had completely changed. As she walked past one of the tables, a guest stopped her. "Excuse me," the guest said kindly. She paused. "That was truly beautiful," the guest continued. "Thank you for sharing that music with us." The servant smiled slightly and nodded. "Thank you," she replied politely before continuing her work. At another table, someone else spoke up. "You should play again sometime," the guest suggested. She smiled again but didn't say much. She wasn't sure what to promise. Life had taught her to focus on the work in front of her rather than dreams that might not fit into reality. Meanwhile, the pianist returned to the bench and sat down again. He rested his hands lightly on the keys but did not begin playing right away. Instead, he watched the servant as she continued moving between tables. There was something thoughtful in his expression now. The small joke he had made earlier in the evening felt very distant. What had started as a playful moment had turned into something far more meaningful. He pressed a few soft notes on the piano, letting the music slowly fill the room again. The melody was gentle this time, calm and reflective. Several guests noticed the change in his playing. It seemed softer, more thoughtful than before. One guest whispered to another, "Even the music feels different now." Across the room, the servant continued doing her work. She cleared empty plates, refilled glasses, and thanked guests politely whenever they spoke to her. But inside, her thoughts were busy. Sitting at the piano had awakened something she had not felt in years. When her fingers had touched the keys, it had been like opening a door to a part of her life she thought had disappeared. The music had come back so naturally, surprised her. It reminded her of long afternoons in that small house from her childhood, where she would sit alone at the old piano and lose track of time. Back then, she had never thought about where music might lead her. She simply enjoyed playing. As she carried a tray of glasses toward the kitchen area, she paused for a moment near the doorway. The sound of the piano drifted gently behind her. She turned her head slightly and listened for a second. A quiet smile appeared on her face. Not because people had applauded, not because anyone had praised her, but because, for a brief moment, she had felt the joy of playing again. And that feeling had reminded her that the love for music was still there. Back in the dining hall, the evening slowly moved toward its later hours. Some guests began finishing their meals while others ordered coffee or dessert. The pianist continued playing, but every now and then his eyes moved across the room toward the servant. He was still thinking about the performance he had just witnessed. After many years in music, he had learned something important. Talent sometimes appears in the most unexpected places. Later in the evening, as some guests prepared to leave, a small group near the front table began discussing the moment again. "I'll remember that for a long time," one of them said. "So will I," another agreed. "It's not every day you see something like that." A third guest nodded. "It reminds you that people can have amazing stories hidden inside them." The others quietly agreed. Across the room, the servant finished clearing another table and carried the dishes toward the kitchen. As she walked past the piano again, the pianist looked up and nodded respectfully. She returned the nod with a small smile before continuing on her way. Neither of them said anything, but the moment spoke for itself. By the time the evening finally came to an end, the dining hall was nearly empty. The last guests thanked the staff and slowly made their way toward the exit. The lights were dimmer now, and the once busy room felt peaceful. The servant helped clean the remaining tables while the pianist closed the lid of the piano. Before leaving, he looked once more across the quiet hall. He thought about how the night had begun like any other evening. Music, dinner, a simple routine. But a single unexpected moment had turned it into something unforgettable. As the servant finished her final task and prepared to leave for the night, she walked past the piano one last time. For a brief second, she paused. Her hand gently touched the smooth wooden surface of the instrument. She didn't say anything. She simply smiled softly and continued walking toward the exit. And though the dining hall would welcome new guests the next day, many of the people who had been there that evening would carry the memory with them. The night when a quiet servant sat down at a piano, played from the heart, and amazed everyone in the room.